Hello, everybody. My name is David Clement. We will get started in just a moment. We'll give everybody a couple more minutes to filter into the webinar. We look forward to presenting to you momentarily. We'll get started at the top of the hour, so just sit tight, and we look forward to this. Thank you. All right, well, welcome, everybody. Open up the camera there. My name is David Clement. I'm with Trend Micro. Happy to have everybody online today for this virtual lunch and learn with Trend Micro and Snyk. We'll be going through some great demos and scenarios around the partnership, and you'll be able to see how our technologies work together and come together. Trend Micro and Snyk have been working together to really expand on the security protection and detection. This is a great partnership that has been built around really coming to market for our customers as trusted security advisors. And we're always looking for new ways and new areas where we need to fill in the gaps and certainly look towards our customer challenges and how those nuances are playing out in terms of the security that customers need going forward. And so you'll see that from world-class research with intelligence feeds and integrated coverage for not only shifting further left with Snyk's technology, but also looking at build pipeline and runtime security requirements that Trend Micro and Snyk together provide quite a unique solution and formula for bringing certain integrated security requirements to helping those challenges with our customers. So without further ado, we'll start the presentation beginning with Jamie Mead.
Great, thanks, David. As David has mentioned, my name is Jamie O'Mara. I lead our global solution architect team here at Snyk. And what I wanted to do today is I really wanted to talk with you guys real quickly about three themes that I really see have shaped the direction of IT over the last couple of years. The first is really, so actually it's digital transformation, cloud technologies, and DevOps methodologies. But let's dive in a little bit more detail around digital transformation. Now, to a lot of people, digital transformation means a lot of different things. And what I want to do is kind of provide some scope to what I'm thinking when I think of digital transformation. I'm really thinking about new software initiatives and new devices. So really new ways to connect with customers to get things done. And you've seen this everywhere, just the way that you have things like Uber Eats and food delivery. We've seen that. You've actually seen through the COVID stuff, people really rotate to more of a digital experience to continue to keep their business alive, and in some cases just grow their business. But in doing so, what tends to happen is when we fund these new initiatives, you have to, a lot of developers will turn to new open source communities to generate that innovation in a very quick manner. And from an organization perspective, more software can tend to lead to more software risk. I think the other area that you see a lot of change around is cloud technologies and its impact that it's had on kind of software development as well as just the organization overall. And when I think of cloud technologies, I don't just think of, public clouds. I also think about those same technologies being run on-prem as well. But it's interesting to see kind of the shift that's happening between the development world and the operations world. So when you look at this, uh, in the pre-cloud era, from a development perspective, you still built your app code and then you had your open source libraries. Uh, on the other side of the equation, from the operations perspective, they provided kind of a full stack developer experience. They did their packaged applications. They were responsible for the virtual machines, the cluster configuration, and then anything below that, they basically managed the vSphere and the hardware. But with the kind of the technologies around cloud, you see a shift happening. So things like packaged software kind of come off the operational side and get moved over to the developer side. They get reintroduced as things like packaged services. And these are the services that developers use to either create their application architecture or tool sets that they use during the creation of those applications to maintain the agile process. But what you also see is things like cloud configuration. They get pulled out of operations and they come back on the other side as infrastructure as code. So things like service meshes and role-based access control, ingress, egress, traffic rules, all of that coming back as configuration, sitting alongside the application and where it lives. Things like virtual machines, again, pulled off the operational side, but come back in the development cycle through the use of containers. So developers creating the containers and laying out the structure of those containers and then delivering those to operations. And of course, some changes have happened obviously on the operational side, where you've seen definitely a shift to the hybrid cloud. So not only the on-prem, but the public cloud as well. And then a new player in this space over the last couple of years, Kubernetes, providing a new API to the data center, whether it's cloud or on-prem. And then really the third area that we've kind of looked or heard a lot about is around process and tools. And that's what we consider DevOps methodology. So a lot of changes have occurred here as well. I would say that Google has really helped on the operational side to really kind of lay the mindset for a lot of the operational folks, along with the other public cloud providers, with the idea of site reliability engineering being the big thing, right? So developers have really enjoyed the capabilities of having canned services. And so when you look at this from a security perspective, you want the security baked into these canned services. So developers aren't actually thinking necessarily about that. In doing so, what that does is it allows us to kind of enable more self-service. And then of course, we can't really enable self-service without having observability. You've got to know what people are doing. And when I talk about observability, I'm not just talking about a performance perspective, but seeing everything that people are doing within your cloud environment and reporting and understanding what they're doing, have audit trails. That kind of observability is super important. There's been a pretty large transition on the development side as well. You've seen teams kind of align themselves for speed and agility. So really getting themselves wrapped around the idea of iterating quickly to deliver software. And in doing so, what that does is that allows them to open up themselves to continuous prioritization, changing direction on in some cases, for some people, it's a monthly basis, in others, it's weekly basis, reprioritizing their backlog and looking at which directions can I go, and then finally being able to do continuous delivery. So it's not just good enough to align for speed and agility and prioritization, but you have to be able to deliver software to production so that you can generate feedback to help change that continuous prioritization aspect. And I think that you've seen this change pretty dramatically over the last couple of years and really focus on DevOps. But the question that you have to ask is like, what about security? Where has security played in this? And I would say to this point a little bit, when you look from a development lifecycle perspective, security's kind of been left behind, but for very good reasons a little bit. If you look at it, is that security teams don't necessarily want to be in the critical delivery path, because one of the things that we talked about is having continuous delivery, and you don't necessarily want to slow down the speed of the business necessarily to look at all the security aspects of the applications as they move to production. But the challenge that happens is that security teams tend to be siloed and really out of the loop on this, and that can result in insecure apps being released. And probably the biggest driver for that is just the pure talent shortage. If you look at the developer to security persona ratio, you're going to see that at the AppSec space, there really tend to be just a shortage and understaffed. So what we really need to do is kind of relook at this and think about, how do we build these processes to provide security in there and make it a very scalable approach? And that's kind of the movement behind DevSecOps, bringing all of this together. And that's where you'll see where Trend and Snyk really come together. As David had mentioned, end-to-end application security throughout the DevOps lifecycle, doing this by protecting the application at runtime, as well as fixing the vulnerabilities at the source, fixing them upstream so that they're not vulnerabilities further down at runtime. Now, for a lot of customers, usually the first question they ask us is really, how do I get started? And my answer to that is really start looking at your open source. Now, the reason you want to look at the open source is because of the way that code is constructed. 80% of your code base that when you generate a new application or you have an existing one, comes from the outside world. It comes from the open source community. And this kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like to build an application. From a developer's perspective, you may write 3 lines of code or 3 files with 80 lines of code in it. And when you look at what's happening underneath, you're looking at your series of direct dependencies. So in this particular case, we had 7 direct dependencies, but of those direct dependencies, most of those coming from the outside world, 59 of those were transitive dependencies. And you kind of add all this together to write that simple application that's 80 lines of code, actually is more like 700,000 lines of code. And bringing all of that in, the vulnerabilities that exist out there, that's the type of stuff that we want to look at. And more of these applications are being built to fund these digital transformations. Of course, at Snyk, we don't feel like shifting left is just enough, because you can't just push tools to the left. You have to actually help developers enable themselves. And to do that, we have to empower the developer, not only with the tools, but to get their mindset and understanding that they will help us own this process. And this is where we really get that scale of security throughout the organization. From the security perspective, we need to also enable those developers. So we have to be able to provide them support as they accept the ownership. And in order to really do that, you really want to build your tools where developers work. And that's really the premise of Snyk, is to work where developers work to make empowering them much easier. So to get that scale, what we need to be able to do is create that frictionless and intuitive solution to make sure that we don't impact the pace, but that's how we also generate the scale in the organization. Of course, the information that we give them when it comes to vulnerabilities has to be very actionable. It's not just good enough to report and say, yes, we have vulnerabilities exist. What can we do to fix those problems? And in some cases, can we just fix them for you and just make it check the box type of move forward process when it comes to vulnerabilities? And then, of course, to be able to do all that, what's super important is that the information has to be very complete, timely, and accurate when it comes to vulnerability data. We can't just rely solely on the public available sources. It really has to be very contextual, and it has to be able to help me make decisions as a developer around fixing the challenges or the vulnerabilities, and as well as prioritizing those. So coverage in this area is super important. Now, just a quick bit about Snyk, if you're not familiar with us. They were founded in 2015 with the vision really to bring AppSec closer to the developer. Since the inception of Snyk, we've helped over 400,000 developers move in this direction. And most importantly, I think one of the areas that we feel pretty proud about are the companies that we've helped do this. So a lot of these companies that you look at, some of them have been on DevOps, kind of a DevOps journey over the last 5 years, but they didn't really understand the DevSecOps movement. And we've been able to kind of come in and help them fix these open source vulnerabilities and become part of the process so that they became very frictionless with their delivery of applications to production. So it gets to be pretty interesting when you start to look at, like, what does that path to production really look like? And from the developer's perspective, it starts pretty early up on their laptop when they're coding. And having the ability to understand what are the vulnerabilities that exist in my application prior to even moving the application further downstream. So what are the plugins that I can see? What kind of reports get generated on my laptop as I'm building my application, as I'm making decisions about what to pull in? Can I test and can I fix those areas? What versions of those open source solutions should I pull in first? And what is the cost to bringing those in? That actually happens further up for the developers and helps them make good decisions about what they're doing. As you move further to the right through the development tool chain for developers, you get into things like the Git source repositories or the source control. And this is kind of the first action around the team being able to see what are the code changes that each developer is making, what is the impact to that from a vulnerability perspective, and what are the things that we can fix across the development tool chain that would can be consumed by all the other developers as well. So being able to test, fix, and monitor at the source code repository levels, super important. Plus, it's the place where developers work. So when we do our demo today, you're going to see how Snyk integrates very nicely where developers work. As you continue to even move further right in the CI/CD space, starting to think about what are the security gates that I can put in place for very critical vulnerabilities that I don't want moving forward, and what can we do to resolve those issues to make sure that we don't necessarily hit the security gates, but they're there as a checkpoint to make sure that as we move into deploy and to runtime, that we've tried to fix as much of the upstream vulnerabilities as much as possible. And then you'll see as I move here with the Snyk and Trend Micro, kind of how this lays out and how the two end-to-end, or the solutions provide that end-to-end capabilities. So Snyk, really helping the developer, and then Trend and Snyk helping in the CI/CD space, especially around containers and the registries. And then of course, Trend really shining really strong in the runtime area, especially in the testing, staging, and production phases. Now, one of the things that I mentioned that makes it super important for developers to experience this frictionless process is to have that automated remediation, helping them solve the complex fix logic. And we'll go through this in the process, but it's not just helping them understand how to fix it, but also using a workflow that they're very familiar with. So things like pull requests, which is a very common way for developers to get their fixes into the code base. These are the things that they're very familiar with. So aligning to what they're familiar with makes it makes it less frictionless for them to consume these changes. And of course, we had mentioned, right, having that comprehensive, accurate, and complete information ahead of time. The false positives are what's going to provide a lot of friction in your environment, or not necessarily having the information. And this is where Snyk really shines with its vulnerability database and helping developers understand the accuracy and the comprehensiveness of the vulnerabilities that exist and keeping the low false positives. Now, what's interesting is when customers start this journey, they'll typically start maybe by just doing an application or two, really trying to exercise those behavioral patterns within their organization to make sure that they are generating a frictionless capability and building it into the process so that it can scale. And when you start to do that and you start to add these projects, you start to get a really good feel overall of where you stand from a security perspective. So that overall security status, monitoring the risk and the exposure of your vulnerabilities and your licensing over time. Looking at what's actionable, what are the things that we can fix, drilling into those and going and find out exactly what we can fix, and looking at the prioritization of that, which is the one just below that, where we look at like, what are the important things to fix first? That's the types of things that we're doing, especially as you start consolidating and you start seeing a lot more of the vulnerabilities. Are we making sure that we're prioritizing the most important ones? And then our overall dependency health, it kind of gives you a view into the outside world, especially when it comes to open source communities, because a lot of the open source communities, some of them rise very quickly, some of them start to fade over time, they get defunded, or there's less activity. And what do we do with applications that see that kind of change? And so with that, what I'd like to do is walk you through a very quick Snyk open source demonstration. but before we do that, I really want to kind of show you what you're going to see today. So we're going to kind of walk through what the open source looks like in the developer workflow. Number one. Number two, we're going to kind of look at the container images and the registries. And then three, when we talked about the changes with cloud and cloud configuration and infrastructure as code, I just wanted to show you a little bit of what that looks like from a developer's perspective when it comes to cloud configuration. Okay. Very good. So one of the things that I had mentioned is that Snyk works where developers work. So when you look at the integrations of Snyk, what you're going to see is that it works with the developer tool chain to make sure that we are embedded where developers want to work. So when it comes to source control, you could see that we work with all of the Git-based products. So GitHub, GitHub Enterprise, if you have things on-prem, GitLab, Bitbucket, Bitbucket Cloud. These are the areas where developers tend to work, and we'll look for workflow that makes sense to what they're doing. As well as when it comes to container registries, right? Working with the 3 public clouds, but in case they have something like Artifactory where it's on-prem, or if they're using Docker Hub to go and get their official images, having that kind of capability built right in is important. And then when it comes to continuous integration, monitoring and looking at those security gates, you're going to see things like the Snyk CLI. You can run those same security gates that run in your continuous integration. You can run them local to your desktop. You can also build in security gates through the different vendors provided here to make sure that whatever you're pushing further down your development tool chain is meeting the policies that you've built internally. And then of course, at the IDE level, you can do plugins as well to bring that awareness further to developer. This is one of the areas that I see growing a lot right now. We're working on building out even more intelligence when it comes to understanding your vulnerabilities, your licensing, and the different versions that are available that are very popular and being used by other developers outside your organization. So the primary component of Snyk comes down to what we call projects. And so when you think about those integrations, a project will be represented by an integration. So I have a particular integration with GitHub. So I have an application called Goof, and I can go start to look at what are the vulnerabilities that exist for my application and what are some of the things that I can do to remediate it. When you look at the application, it'll kind of list out the number of vulnerabilities that exist today. It'll also show you the dependencies. So if you went and looked at this application, you might see 20 direct dependencies, but with the transitive dependencies, the actual numbers are actually more like 471. You can get a good feel for the source of where the project comes from. And then most importantly, for a lot of developers, which branch am I working on? So this is again, this is tied to Git and GitHub, and the branch that they're working on, and the one that we're viewing is what's going to be very important to them. When you start to look at the issues, you have some understanding of the different issue types, whether it's a vulnerability issue or a particular licensing issue, and the severity of that based off the CVSS score. We can kind of bucket and bracket these so that you're working on the most highest priority items first, as well as looking at the exploit maturity of that particular vulnerability. It gives us a good understanding of where we should focus from a prioritization perspective. In addition, from a developer's standpoint, if you want to understand the dependency tree, you can open up the dependencies to look at where do those vulnerabilities sit within relation to my dependency. So basically, is it a transitive dependency that has the vulnerability, and how do I go about fixing that? That's usually what most developers want to know, is how do I fix it quickly? And that's what the remediation tab really does for them. To clear up a number of these vulnerabilities, if they were to upgrade this version of the library, ST, from 0.2.4 to 1.2.2, they could start to remediate a number of vulnerabilities for them. Now, learning a lot of this from a developer's perspective might not be as interesting as we would all like it to be. So in Snyk, we've built in this capability where they can just go ahead and say, open a pull request for me and show me the same set of information in the tools where I tend to work. And so that's what you'll see when you click over and you go to GitHub, for example. If I pull up that same application, what I can start to see is that Snyk will do one of two things. I can either manually generate the pull request by going to Snyk, or Snyk's smart enough to say, hey, you know what? I know I have the same information. Let me just go ahead and generate this pull request for you inside of GitHub. And again, by doing this, I can start to see all the same set of information that I saw before. I can see the severity and which vulnerabilities will be fixed, and whether looking at the exploit maturity of it. I can also run a number of checks on this. So if I was to merge this pull request, even though it came from Snyk, it also passes the security checks, so we know that we're good there, and it also would pass the license check, which means that we are in compliance with the policies set forth within the company around licensing. So knowing this, the only other thing that I would like to know is to make sure that this particular project doesn't have it set up, but does this compile? And you can put those checks in place with that, knowing that it will compile and that it passed all of its tests. And you can do that using your CI tools. I would go ahead and merge this request. And now that fixed for those vulnerabilities are part of my baseline going forward. And when other developers resync with GitHub, they now have those vulnerabilities fixed in their environment as well. All right, so the other area where Snyk really shines or can really help developers is around the container images themselves. So again, we'll have another project for the container image. So here's that same application, but containerized with its series of vulnerabilities. So what this does is it really opens up not only the application vulnerabilities, but now it also pulls in the container vulnerabilities and how those were introduced to help the developer figure out how to remediate the issues. So real quick, you can see the number of vulnerabilities here, the number of dependencies. Again, you'll see the source. This one happens to be Docker Hub. And most importantly, you'll see a couple of things here. You'll see the base image. So what was the image that I used to create the container? And then what was the image tag? From that, I get the same set of information with severity and exploit maturity, but you'll notice that I have some new areas down here. So I have stuff for the OS binaries as well as the Docker file instructions. Where this is pretty interesting from a developer's perspective is they can see how many of the vulnerabilities came in from the base image, so the one I chose to start from, and how many did I introduce as a developer. So in this case, I introduced up to 166 of the vulnerabilities mentioned above out of the 711. And so when I start to look at this, I can say, oh, all right, as a developer, what did I do? And I can see that by looking at the Docker file instructions here. By running this specific command, which might be a very common thing for developers to do for things that they want to install into the container image, they introduced this. So what they can do is they can go back and look at these Docker file instructions to make determinations whether they need to change that or not. In this particular one, very similar, but the Docker file instruction actually introduced through the base image. So what can I do about the base image perspective? Well, I can see what my current image is here and the number of vulnerabilities and how many are high. I can also then start to look at major upgrades to the base image or alternative upgrades that will help me reduce my overall vulnerability count. And that's a nice feature for developers to really understand how they can help participate in reducing number of vulnerabilities within the container images that they built. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you is when it comes to configuration, infrastructure as code, and that's usually from the developer's perspective when it comes to generating things like Kubernetes YAML files to deploy their application. And so when developers do this, they don't really have a lot of guidelines that they necessarily have to follow. And so that's what Snyk is designed to do, is help developers understand, based on what you've put into the deployment manifest files, what are the things that you're introducing that could be or will be potential problems or don't meet the security policy code of the organization. So for example, this example came straight off of the Kubernetes website, and in it, they allow the container to run as root, which in terms of our policy would be a medium or a high. In this case, we had it marked as medium. but you can choose to change the policy for your organization so that developers become very aware of the configuration as code as they're building it up, to make sure that they are within policy and that their applications can be deployed into both test, staging, and production. And with that, I want to turn it over to my partner, Andre, to walk us through some of the runtime and the container image aspects from Trend.
Thank you, Jamie. Hello, everyone. This is Adre Alves speaking here. Good to be with you today. I have been a cloud security architect for Trend Micro for a while. Very excited about this integration, this partnership with Snyk. It is true that Trend Micro has been there for a while. We usually have been living on production land, and we are excited to get closer and closer to where applications are born, right? Getting closer to developers. So it is always a very good thing to partner up. We cannot think of better partners than Snyk to help us get to the journey of understanding how developers want to integrate security into their application. We do have a good idea of what security operations look like on a day-to-day when things are live, when things are providing value to the business. And our strong point is in that area, right? So today I want to speak to you about as Jamie mentioned, end-to-end application vulnerability handling. We're going to start from the perspective of runtime, as you're seeing there on your screen right now. We've been helping protecting applications where they live, right? No matter what is the type of infrastructure that powers your application, and we have been successful on protecting the applications against a multitude of vulnerabilities, different types of vulnerabilities. Snyk being very powerful with open source vulnerabilities and opening everyone's eyes to the reality that when you're leveraging open source tools, there is a whole realm of vulnerabilities that you might not have been aware about. But there are the vulnerabilities that you are very aware about as well, and it doesn't make it any more comfortable to live with those vulnerabilities, right? So in this presentation, we're going to go over what can we do to protect applications where they live, and as the convergence that you're seeing on this slide points you towards how we can work together to protect the whole lifetime of an application. You probably know Trend Micro as a security vendor, probably from an anti-malware, antivirus perspective. We have been out there for 32 years now. We have our fair share of customers. We take pride on have been founded by Eva Chen, our CEO from the beginning, still our CEO today with engineer minds. She was one of the first developers for Trend, and we are spread across the globe in all continents today with a very healthy business. What this allows us to do at the end of the day is the value this empowers us to provide to the industry is very special. We invest heavily in threats and vulnerability research. We have the most successful program in the industry currently for vulnerability disclosure. You know how security researchers, they're not necessarily interested on handling a long and very bureaucratic process of vulnerability disclosure, responsible vulnerability disclosure. So we provide the facility, the most trusted facility in the industry today for vulnerability researchers to commercialize their findings. And we take the responsibility of making sure that vulnerabilities are not disclosed too early. So we handle the vulnerability process with a series of vendors. So if you're looking at what is the share in the industry of the vulnerabilities that are found by bug bounty programs, by hacking marathons, by hacking conferences, you're going to see that we have a fair portion of this market. By employing researchers as well, we're able to provide insights, and we do so on a yearly basis of where we think the threat landscape is going to go. You're going to find interesting that for the 2020 reports, it's not too hard to predict that as more businesses become application first businesses, therefore the practice of developing applications has to become more mature, more dynamic. The offenders, the hackers, are going to look for ways of compromising application build pipelines, right? This is our prediction for this year, an attempt of intercepting good security practices to deliver applications. There will try to be in that workflow as well. You're going to see as well that misconfigurations are going to play a big role. They have played a big role as well on the security aspect of applications, right? So configuring the infrastructure that is going to power your application is going to become even more of a critical, relevant task, and it is very important that we have visibility over this as well. We're going to see that as serverless applications also become more and more prevalent, we're going to have a shift of targeting application codes and targeting the application itself, the business side of the application, business logic of the application. So not only the vulnerabilities of the infrastructure, of the runtime, of the platforms that are being used, but the vulnerabilities in the application itself, they're going to be even more targeted. So when we place this in a building, application build per perspective, there are many ways we can help you to fight back, right? To be responsive to this vulnerability and threat landscape. We have been helping security operations teams for a while on protecting the infrastructure that powers the applications. So protecting virtual deployments in the data center, in the private cloud, protecting instances in public clouds. More recently, protecting serverless applications as well with a runtime application self-protection facility. And as we shift further left to the application creation itself, to the codes that is triggering the sole construction, the sole building of an application infrastructure and of a new version of an application, we're going to see Snyk helping more and more with vulnerability scanning, being where the developers are building as well. So today, for a demo, I had prepared what would be a workflow of a security operations person that actually has the responsibility of reviewing and notifying, responding to vulnerabilities across the whole application lifecycle. So how would Snyk and Trend Micro help such a person to achieve a vulnerability handling process across a modern application delivery landscape? So I will shift over now to my demo environment. My starting point is Snyk visibility over my repositories, right? So as Jamie demonstrated, Snyk would be able to report vulnerabilities that are found where the source rests, where the source code is stored. So stored by looking, it looks like I have a few vulnerable projects. That would be a handful, right? So let me start with this application. This is my most prevalent application. When I take a look on what has been found, if I dig on the findings here, I'm seeing that I have a multitude of severities. I just want to focus initially on high severity vulnerabilities. I don't want to focus on license issues initially. My focus here will be on what can be exploited in the wilds, right? What can be exploited in runtime. So I have an XML external entity injection that doesn't look very good. But what catches my attention here as a security professional is this vulnerability of arbitrary code execution. Those are three words that I never want to hear about together, right? That would mean that my application is open to how code designed to be executed. I noticed this has been introduced through an Apache struts vulnerability, right? So I do want to know a little bit more about this vulnerability. Maybe I can click and fix vulnerability, or actually maybe I want to click on more about this issue. I'm seeing that the CVSS score, the score that ranks how damaging this vulnerability could be, almost gives out the maximum score of severity. And I'm looking here as a security professional on the CVE identifier. This helps me to refer to or to a common industry vulnerability and vulnerabilities and exposures database. And when I look at the disclosure and references, I see that the zero-day initiative, the trend marker zero-day initiative, also has an entry about this vulnerability. So now I do have some work to do. Of course, I can notify my developers. I can open a pull request on GitHub to have this vulnerability dealt with at source. But that wouldn't change the reality that I do have an application running right now that is vulnerable. So I will walk through my workload security workflow. Now I am able to count with a solution that's powerful enough to protect my cloud instances across different cloud providers. This workflow enables me to have instant visibility across an inventory of my instances across all the major cloud providers, AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. I know that my vulnerable application is a Java application, and I have created here searching facilities that will group my application infrastructure in ways that are useful for me. I guess the most useful way here is that I have a search criteria for this Java application group. This search criteria basically is looking at AWS tagging metadata, so that I identified that this application group is there by rating tags on AWS. So I see that I have a workload here. It is an Amazon EC2 instance that is providing this application. I'm seeing that this application is being provided in a containerized fashion. So it is good to know that workload security can protect EC2 instances and containers running on top of EC2 instances or containers running on top of container services like EKS. And I happen to have an intrusion prevention security policy that would help me to protect against this vulnerability. So with intrusion prevention, I can analyze the traffic that is incoming to the instance and protect against vulnerabilities. My workflow would dictate that I want to scan for recommendations. That basically means trying to identify what are possible vulnerabilities in my instance, in this scenario, in my containerized application as well, so I can run a scan for recommendation and get results very quickly. But as I had this ready, I actually identified the Apache Struts vulnerabilities that were present on this application. So I saw that this is CVE 2016 for a Java for an Apache Struts vulnerability, and I found that I already actually have protection in place for this vulnerability. I would be able to then find more information about the vulnerability itself. But from my workflow perspective as a security operations person, I can rest assured that that vulnerability that has been found at source is protected in runtime by the means of a payload inspection rule. So I'm looking at the traffic that's incoming to my application, and I'm protecting my application on the fly. This is very precious. That means that now I can wait for the pull request to be approved and to come into production to trigger this application build process for a new version of the application, while at the same time knowing that this application is protected in runtime. So this is very good. I'm protecting more traditional workloads like EC2 instances. I'm protecting modern workloads like containers. But what if this application was a serverless application, right? Would I be able to protect this application in runtime as well as a serverless application? So that's where the Trend Micro Cloud One platform really shines. Our objective with the Cloud One security services platform is to provide a variety of security services for all types of applications and then for all types of security needs. So I do have a runtime application self-protection solution that would be able to, let me expand my search range here to 30 days, would be able to protect my applications, my serverless applications as a security library. It basically means that I would import on the list of requirements for my application and would refer to one more security library. So if you, in this scenario, I have a Java application, I can just point towards a Java jar file as a library, as a requisite. If this was a Python application, I would be able to resort to pip. But what I'm doing at the end of the day is protecting the application as one component of the application, as a library, by instrumenting all the interactions of the application during runtime. This allows me to, for example, for this Lambda function, to protect the application against malicious payloads. So functionality that you would expect to happen maybe over the network, maybe by a web application firewall. We are instrumenting the application to provide the same capabilities. And as you're seeing here, we are protecting against the CVEs that I also protect against on the container landscape and on the instance, EC2 instance, or Azure virtual machines, or Google Compute Engine workspaces. I'm protecting against Apache Struts vulnerabilities and any other web application vulnerabilities And I'm doing so in a way that I don't need to inspect traffic. I am inspecting the application interaction itself as a component of the application. So that means I don't have to worry about the encrypting file, which is a big win nowadays with service meshes becoming more and more prevalent and encrypting even lateral traffic. So that's very good. That means that by identifying vulnerabilities at source, I can have a security strategy in place that protects against vulnerabilities in runtime while I'm waiting for the new version, the not vulnerable version of the application to come up in runtime. But this is very centric to the application itself. What about the security? What about the cloud services that I'm using to run my application on, right? So what about the configurations of my Amazon services? We also can give you visibility about possible misconfigurations in your cloud services. You're seeing here that I have Azure and AWS accounts connected to Conformity. Conformity is there to give you a view over configurations, cloud service configurations, so that you can have a more holistic approach that will look at vulnerabilities from an infrastructure perspective. But as our reports, our threat assessment report for 2020 predicts, misconfigurations on cloud providers are also going to be an entry point for exploitations. It is very good to be able to assess my whole infrastructure, the entirety of my cloud services across different cloud providers against pillars of a well-architected framework, or maybe against industry established standards and frameworks like NIST, like CIS, like ISO. This is very good. But at Trend Micro, we're trying to get as close as possible to the inception, the creation of the infrastructure, the creation of the application. So that means that we're also providing an IDE plugin, in this case for Visual Studio Code, where I can actually scan the templates that would rise up the infrastructure that powers my application, and I can assess my configurations right there from the IDE and generate findings reports right there on the IDE. So this would give the developers the ability of addressing misconfigurations even before deploying the infrastructure, while giving security operations folks the ability of assessing what's the services that are being used currently in runtime. So hopefully this demonstrates how Snyk and Trend Micro are working together to provide a full end-to-end application and infrastructure protection process. We're very excited about this partnership. We believe that the two companies together will be able to provide you with a good experience that covers all the bases of what's bringing value to your company. With that, I want to relay back to David. There is a call to action here, right, David?
Great, thank you, Andre, and thank you, Jamie, for your earlier discussion. So a great set of tools, a great set of explanations around the partnership. We'll get into a couple of questions just momentarily, but we just want to bring up that we are here to offer you a joint meeting. If you're interested in learning more about this solution, learning more about Trend and Snyk together, you can book a meeting with Brittany Himmelfarb of Trend Micro or Jamie O'Meara of Snyk, as you see here. You take a quick picture of that. We'll send that out as well. This will give you an option to see a demo, to learn more about the solution sets as well. And you'll receive a $50 Amazon card for attending the meeting as well. And so this is something that we'll get out to you within 24 to 48 hours or so. based on that. So we encourage you to take advantage of that. And again, thank you for being a part of this webinar in terms of looking at open source dependencies and vulnerabilities from Snyk point of view, all the way to those vulnerabilities and runtime scenarios from Trend. So let's take a quick look at some of the questions that have come through. Maybe I'll start with Andre. What places do Trend Micro fit on the modern software development lifecycle? What places does Trend Micro fit on the modern software development lifecycle?
Thank you. That's a great question. So I think it's important to understand the starting points for Trend Micro is the runtime, right? And then we're shifting left, coming all the way to from runtime to the build time, right? So in the modern life cycle, we're present in build time. In build time, we're scanning for your infrastructure as code, templates in reference to the cloud providers' services. And then when it comes to the actual lifetime of the application and production, we are also there in runtime to protect the applications across different types of infrastructures, right? So yeah, as we're fitting far left, and we want to go further left, Snyk is helping us to get us left as possible. But yeah, as you would be able to count with Trend Micro for build time scannings of infrastructure and of configurations as well, and you would be able to count with Trend Micro for runtime protections.
All right, thanks, Andre. For Jamie, can developers run local scans on their machines to get feedback as to the libraries they are using?
Yeah, absolutely. So Snyk has a CLI that you can use to run, but I think what you'll see even more as this market continues to mature is the ability right within your IDE to have visibility to your dependencies, not only from a vulnerability perspective, a licensing perspective, and just overall consumption by other developers outside your organization. So it becomes it provides you enough analytics to kind of make determinations about the libraries that you do have and how you fix the vulnerabilities associated with them.
Can Snyk integrate with test environments, build automation, CI/CD?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's kind of one of the areas where it does shine is around the CI/CD and looking at those security gates as you're building out your different environments and what is the policy within your organization to address vulnerabilities and where should the security gate actually sit and prevent things from moving forward.
Andre, one question for you. How does Trend Micro help my organization with zero-day vulnerabilities?
Perfect, yes. So zero-day vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities that have just been disclosed. You don't necessarily have a patch fix for those vulnerabilities. So through our zero-day initiative program, we are able to have on the day zero protection against zero-day vulnerabilities. We're also able to have pre-day zero protections for undisclosed vulnerabilities. So those would be the vulnerabilities that have been negotiated with the zero-day initiative that have not been fixed yet, and that they are still not in public domain or public knowledge. Trend Micro customers are protected against vulnerabilities even before they get a CVE assigned to them, given that the vulnerability has been disclosed with the zero-day initiative program. So it's one of the great advantages of having a big research body, but also a well-respected program, a vulnerability disclosure program that is well-known and well-relied on in the industry.
Hey, perfect. Well, I want to thank Jamie O'Meara, Adre Alves for your time today. Great presentation. That wraps up our webinar today. You'll get more information through email on the webinar itself. And we look forward to you joining our next series in the future. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.